Everybody.
Morning.
Hope you can see and hear okay. I'm seeing thumbs up. It's a good sign. Okay. So this morning, there seems to be an unreasonable amount of road noise outside. I'm seeing trucks pulling their power boats and all kinds of things, given it's a nice weekend. So unfortunately, I've closed up all the windows. That's all I can do. So I'm hoping that that's not too much of a distraction this morning. So welcome back to our virtual Zendo. Nice to see everybody, and I hope everyone's doing okay. As Hoshin mentioned, we're continuing to work our way through the 108 gates of Dharma illumination, and this week we take up gate number 33, which is awareness of time is a gate of Dharma illumination, for with it we do not treat spoken teaching lightly. So we know time is a topic that comes up in our tradition, and there are all kinds of ways of working with time, thinking about time. So today we get to consider awareness of time. So when I read this gate, what comes up for me is that there's a real feeling of urgency here, right? There's a sense of urgency and not wasting time. So this is not about just applying ourselves, putting a lot of energy into our practice. I think it's also about applying ourselves appropriately, or effectively is a strange word to use when we're not kind of reaching for a goal. But it's about sort of having the right direction, right? If we don't have the right direction, the resources we're putting into our practice could be considered a waste of time. So if our practice is based on ignorance, for instance, that we can consider that a waste of time. So first, let me review, let's think about the ways that Dogen looks at time. Then let's take up this idea about wasting time in our practice and whether that's actually even possible. So there's lots to chew on today. So according to Hojo-san, Dogen considers time in three different ways, three particular ways. The first is the common way that we always think about time. The time flows from the past through the future to the present. That there's some kind of linearity of time. There's some flow of time. The second way is that time is the absolute presence, absolute present, right? So the past has gone, the future's not here yet. Neither of those things actually exist, right? Past has already left us, it doesn't exist. Future hasn't come, it doesn't exist. The only actual time is the present, or the eternal now. So there's a famous passage in the Genjo Koan, which I'm sure you've heard before, but again, has some relevance here, where Dogen says, firewood becomes ash, ash cannot become firewood again. However, we should not view ash as after and firewood as before. We should know that firewood dwells in the Dharma position of firewood and has its own before and after. Although before and after exist, past and future are cut off. Ash stays at the position of ash with its own before and after. So I'm sure you've run into this paragraph before, this passage before. Although before and after exist, past and future are cut off. So at this present moment, firewood is completely dwelling in the position of firewood. So in the past, it was a live tree. That time has gone. If we burn it in the future, after the firewood's burned, then the firewood will be completely gone, only ash will exist, right? So the ash isn't here now, and the live tree isn't here now. There is only firewood now. So the past isn't reality anymore. The future isn't reality yet. Only this moment, this now, is actual. So this is what this passage means when it says past and future are cut off, right? So, Hojo-san frequently explains how Uchiyama Roshi says that the present moment has no length, because if it had some length, we could cut it in half. And there would be, some part of now, which would be in the past, and some part of now, which would be in the future. And of course, that isn't possible. So, the present, if you look at it this way, the present is only a boundary between the not existing past and the not existing future, right? So in this way, the present is zero. So when we hear Hojo saying things like, the present is zero, time disappears when we look at it in this way. So that's the second way of Dogen's looking at time. Time is the absolute present, or what you'll hear me sometimes call the eternal now. In our Wednesday group, I often talk about the eternal now, right? So the third way of considering time, according to Dogen, is the time doesn't actually flow. So in the Bendawa, he says, therefore, even if only one person sits for a short time, because this zazen is one with all existence and completely permeates all times, it performs everlasting Buddha guidance within the inexhaustible Dharma world in the past, present, and future. That's also a fairly famous passage, which you may have run into. So in our zazen, we sit in this absolute present, or we sit in this eternal now. And when we do that, we are one with all time and all beings across space, and there is no separation. So there's no separation between us and anything. And this is the time that doesn't flow. So there's only one moment, and it doesn't have any parts, it doesn't have any segments like minutes and seconds and centuries. There are, those are kind of our ideas and our ways of measuring time according to our human perception. We need those measures in order to function. You wouldn't have been here at 10:10 for the start of this talk if we didn't have some conventional means of measuring time and dividing it up and saying, well, there's a before and there's an after. But that's really just our story about this eternal now that does not actually flow. So there actually is no linearity to this eternal now. So in our conventional thinking about time, we can write a story about ourselves as karmically conditioned beings, that we were born at some point and we had, baby bodies and we moved through time and became adults, and we're going to continue to move through time and become older. So Dogen says that in Zazen, the time that doesn't flow appears because we recognize that we are in the absolute present. So it isn't that the absolute present somehow is created, but it appears to us. We become familiar with it, or we have some experience of it because we're sitting in Zazen. We're opening the hand of thought. So there's no coming and going in the absolute present, right? It wouldn't be possible. So there's only what we might call the eternity of awakening throughout all space and time, right? This is Buddha's eternal life. So it goes out in all directions. We're not separate from any part of it. There is just this one great unified reality, this eternal now. So Aki Roshi said, it's pointless for human beings merely to live a life that lasts 70 or 80 years, right? So he's talking about this third way of considering time that doesn't flow. So we can consider that our lives are greater than, somehow, this limited human form and this limited human lifespan of 70 or 80 years when we're putting ourselves in that place where time doesn't flow. And there is only the absolute present. So all three of these ways of considering time are true, although they seem to contradict each other. We get to hold all three of these things together somehow. Somehow we're right in the middle of all of them, even though when we put them right next to each other, they seem to be saying something very different. Somehow they are all the case. They are all true. So awareness of time in the conventional sense reminds us that in spite of what Soaki Roshi said, this body does have a limited lifespan. We're only on this earth for a certain period of time. We get only so many years in which we can practice in this form and carry out our bodhisattva vows, whether we've taken them formally or not. The fact that we're practicing means we're aspiring to something. This body is only going to last so long, and in this condition, right? So there is some limit on the amount of time we have to do the practice that we aspire to do. So in this sense, it's foolish to waste time either by not practicing or by practicing unskillfully, or in some way which is less than effective, whatever that means in our practice, right? So 3 texts come to mind. When I read this gate, immediately 3 texts come up for me, maybe for you also. The Sandokai, the Fukanza Zengi, and the Gakudo Yojinshu. So I want to talk a little bit about each of these 3 and their relation to this gate. So the Sandokai, or the Merging of Difference and Sameness, you probably know, is a long poem by Shuto Shichien, or Sekito Kisen is his Japanese name, written in the 8th century. So this is not a new text. So the theme of this poem is that we need to see both the individual and the universal. We need to see both form and emptiness, or difference and sameness, right? This is the difference and sameness in the Merging of Difference and Sameness. So seeing both of these things, small self and universal self, form and emptiness, right? Individuality, universality, is seeing reality. It's seeing all of reality. So if we don't see both aspects, we're only aware of half the story. We're not living our lives completely. right? We're not fully in touch with, fully engaged with the totality of this moment or everything that's going on. Of course, it's easy to just see the small self, just see the individual, just see the form. Although sometimes we get sucked into wanting to live only in the world of emptiness or universality or sameness, and we know we can't live there either. We have to sort of live in both places. Both of these things are true. So the end of the Sandokai says, I humbly urge you who study the mystery, don't waste time, or sometimes it's translated, don't pass your days and nights in vain. Sometimes you'll find that verse written on the wooden block that gets hit at the end of the night to sort of signal the end, the end of the practice day. So it's saying, go to sleep, get up, don't waste time. So not wasting time in this context is not practicing with just one side, not practicing just in the world of form or just in the world of emptiness, right? It's saying we need to see both and we need to see all of reality. So if we're not making an effort to awaken to both of these aspects, then according to this, we're not really practicing wholeheartedly. That doesn't mean that in this form, in this moment, we can necessarily see the totality of this moment. We can't necessarily see all of reality because, as Hojo-san sometimes says, we're baby bodhisattvas, right? We're aspiring, right, to manifest our awakening. So this doesn't mean if we're not completely manifesting awakening and moving through the world as a completely realized Buddha, that somehow our practice is a waste of time. Don't fall into that pitfall, right? If we're making the effort to really practice wholeheartedly, to see both aspects of reality, that's what this is talking about. So in Living by Vow, Hojo-san says about these two last lines in the Sandokai, no matter how hard we practice, if our practice is not based on true reality, we're wasting our time. So if we are truly aspiring to see all of reality, we are making wholehearted effort. So Suzuki Roshi said about this line, don't sacrifice actual practice for idealistic practice. I think that's a really interesting way to look at this, right? So if we're practicing based on how we want things to be, about our ideas about practice, our ideas about ourselves as practitioners, things should be this way, things shouldn't be that way, we're sacrificing actual practice for idealistic practice. So we're not awake to both difference and sameness. So I think the way he put that was really kind of interesting. So Sandokai has something to say about this. Dogen's Fukanza Zengi, or Universal Recommendations for Zazen, also has something to say. You probably know Fukanza Zengi is the first thing that Dogen wrote when he came back from China after he'd been practicing with his teacher, Tendo Nyojo, and had had some experience of awakening while he was sitting in the Zendo. This is according to the story, right? So out of that teaching and training and practice, he understood the importance of Zazen. He wanted to help other people understand that by providing some instructions and explanations. And that is the basis of this text, with which you are probably familiar. So near the end of the Fukanza Zengi, he says, you have gained the pivotal opportunity of human form. Do not use your time in vain. You are maintaining the essential working of the Buddha way. Who would take wasteful delight in the spark from the flintstone? Besides, form and substance are like the dew on the grass, destiny like the dart of lightning, emptied in an instant and vanished in a flash. So human form is the only form within the 6 realms of samsara where we actually have the chance to practice, right? The other 5 in that 6 element realm have some kind of impediment to practice. So in this human form, this is the ground of practice. This is the opportunity that we get to manifest awakening and do our practice. So we're frequently encouraged by writings and teachings in this tradition to be grateful to have been born in this form and to have the opportunity to practice. Fukanza Zengi says it's a pivotal opportunity. We need to not throw that opportunity away, right? So the text goes on to say that what we're engaged in is the essential working of the Buddha way. So there's nothing outside of that, right? We don't need to waste time looking around for things to fulfill our cravings or fulfill our need to be something we're not, or to be somebody we like better, or have better circumstances or something like that, some way to make us better. Next line says, who would take wasteful delight in the spark from the flintstone? So the spark is not the fire, right? If you're trying to light a fire and you're hitting that flintstone against something and a spark comes out, the spark is not the fire. It looks pretty, right? It's interesting, it's encouraging, but it flashes and then it's gone. So nothing more kind of comes of that. So it's a distraction, if you will, from the main thing. It's a distraction from the fire. So to take delight in just having the spark rather than the actual fire is a wasted opportunity. So that's just being sort of pulled around by three poisonous mind, right? We're going to grasp after the spark. Earlier in the text, before the part that I quoted here, Dogen asks why we think we need to leave our own seats in our own homes and travel around through dusty foreign lands looking for awakening or peace or nirvana or something we want. He actually says that's fruitless or that's meaningless, and it's just a distraction from the practice and the awakening. They're right here in front of us that we already have access to. So that kind of meandering around looking for something is a distraction and is a waste of time. Then Dogen reminds us that forms are impermanent, which we know. Not only are the things we're chasing after impermanent and therefore ultimately unsatisfying, but again, this human form won't last forever. So we're running after things that are impermanent, using a form that's impermanent. Somehow there's just never going to be satisfaction there, right? So we have to take this opportunity to practice while we can. Everything is changing. So the last text that arose for me that I want to just mention is Dogen's Gakudo Yojinshu, or Points to Watch in Studying the Way, where he says, out of fear of time slipping away too swiftly, practice the way as if you were trying to extinguish a fire enveloping your head. Reflecting on the transiency of your bodily life, practice as diligently as the Buddha did when he raised his foot for 7 days. This image probably of practicing as though your head was on fire may also be familiar. Uncomfortable, but familiar, right? So if your head was on fire, you'd be responding pretty quickly and wholeheartedly to do something about that, right? So it's a well-known passage. So I think it's not a coincidence that Dogen uses a fire image here. I'm thinking it's related to, of course, this idea in the Lotus Sutra that we're living in a burning house that's aflame because of our craving and aversion and delusion and all the things we're attached to. This samsaric world is a kind of a burning world. So we're in the midst of all of our stuff. So I'm guessing there's a link there, right? Because the opposite of that is peace and calm and nirvana and not being pulled around by our desires and not creating suffering for ourselves and for others, based on that kind of delusion. So our heads being on fire, I think, is a powerful image, right, of what's going on up here. All the energy that comes from our thinking, our emotions, thoughts, feelings, perceptions, wanting things, right? It's a really kind of a powerful image. There's a lot of energy happening here. So it feels like some encouragement. Pay attention. Pay attention to what's happening here because something important is going on. So reflecting on the transiency of your bodily life, he says, so here again, limited amount of time to practice in this form. Practice as diligently as the Buddha did when he raised his foot for 7 days. So that sounds interesting, doesn't it? There's a story that the Buddha raised his foot or stood on one foot or stood on tiptoe, depends on the translation, for 7 days out of admiration and respect for a Buddha called Pushya. I have to say I don't know the circumstances of that story, but we can imagine the effort it takes to stand on one foot for a week, right? There's some diligence there, there's some commitment, some effort there to stand on one foot for a week. So practice as diligently as the Buddha did when he raised his foot for 7 days. So Dogen says that's the kind of commitment we need to have to practice, right? To using our time well and to taking advantage of the opportunities that we have to do this. So all three of these texts, I think, are making some similar points, or making the same points. One, this human body is impermanent. It's the ground of our practice, and we have to take advantage of this form while we have it. So we need this body in order to practice. We can't practice without it. We have the opportunity born in the human realm to do this thing. And that opportunity is not permanent. Second point is not making an effort to see both form and emptiness, or both individual and universal. is not practicing based on true reality, and therefore is not a good use of our time. So again, it's not about that, you know, if we're not fully awakened in this moment, we're somehow wasting our time. It's about our aspiration. It's about our wholeheartedness. It's about making the effort to see and live in the middle of both of these aspects, right? Third point is that getting distracted by chasing after stuff, satisfying cravings, doing all of that, is wasting the limited time we have in this form to wake up, right? We're using our energy somewhere maybe we don't need to. Can we pull that back and focus our energy on sitting and manifesting awakening and carrying out vows? So again, awareness of time is a gate of Dharma illumination, for with it we do not treat spoken teaching lightly. So I think it's interesting that this specifically says spoken teaching. And I went back to the kanji just to make sure that was like the feeling, and it's definitely the feeling. The kanjis in there are about discourse or remarks or statements or something. You know, it's very much about a kind of a spoken teaching. So I think it's really interesting that that doesn't say sutra study, like written sutra study or something like that. There's some immediacy about spoken teaching. So of course the sutras are said to be transcriptions or records of Buddha's spoken teaching, words spoken by the Buddha. Some of those of course are apocryphal. But you know, where they begin, thus have I heard, here's Ananda recording what he heard the Buddha say. So there's some immediacy about that. We can imagine that he's sitting there in front of Buddha actually hearing the spoken teaching. So spoken teaching here could just mean all the sutras, right? But I'm going to read something different into that. Again, this is what comes up for me when I read this. It doesn't say this is the kanji. So I'm going to read something into this that I think there's some feeling about this gate statement. So maybe you're familiar with the expression ichigo ichie, one time, one meeting. The idea is that this moment is not repeatable. This is a one-time thing. It will never come again. So when we encounter some teaching, we have to take advantage of that moment. Now, I'm putting this in a more Buddhist context. This phrase generally, and Doju might know more about this than I, you know, it's a general Japanese phrase. You know, we run into it like in the tea ceremony, but it can be just any meeting you have with somebody. So I'm going to read this in a kind of a Buddhist context and say, we've encountered some spoken teaching, we need to take advantage of that moment, that meeting with the Dharma, right? If teachings are written down, maybe we can read them later. That's, you know, the maintaining version of the Dharma treasure, 3 kinds of 3 treasures, that's the maintaining version. And of course, that moment of returning to a teaching, reading it again later, is different than the moment we first encounter it. Not better or worse necessarily, but it's different. So if we hear spoken teachings, it seems to me that's a moment of encounter. There's a dialogue happening, whether or not there's like spoken interaction. That's a moment of encounter. So that's an interesting moment. So whether the speaker is a Dharma teacher or a Sangha friend, or you hear somebody chanting sutras, you know, doing some liturgy, it could even be the sound of the rain outside. It could be the cat purring, right? It could be the wind blowing. It could be anything, because Dogen says all, you know, insentient beings are expounding the Dharma. So that moment won't come again, and everything is impermanent. So that's a one-time, one meeting, right? It's a moment of encounter. So in that moment of encounter, we have the chance to experience those teachings, to really take them in with a fresh mind. If this is a one-time encounter, I need to be really open, right, to taking in whatever that is in a fresh way, with a fresh mind. So this is before we judge and label and decide about stuff and put our own things in there, right? We have the chance to absorb that spoken teaching, I think, with body and mind before we try to study it. Now, isn't that interesting, right? Encountering the Dharma, encountering the teachings, being open to them, letting them in before we study it, because we think study is a good thing, right? You know, if we're going to really understand the Dharma, we want to hang on to it and study it. So this kind of fresh encounter, by the way, is the reason that Sawaki Roshi found zazen so meaningful or so important, right? It's not because sitting gives us the spaciousness to understand Ichigo Ichie. It's kind of backwards, right? It's because this is the way he first encountered zazen. So he, at the age of 16, he's a young kid, wants to be a monk, goes to Eheji and wants to be ordained. And they say, you can't be ordained because you don't have a teacher. Well, he doesn't know any teachers. He's stuck and he can't go forward. But somehow he becomes a lay worker there at Eheji. And because he's there all the time and he's working, he has the opportunity to see what the monks are doing. And he's seeing that they're sitting day after day after day. Particularly, he's watching their zazen. He says there's something deep and sacred about that. He can't identify what that is. He can't articulate what that feeling is. But there's something going on there for him, right? He couldn't identify the source of it, but it felt important, it felt meaningful. So later he said that he had encountered the real thing before studying what it was. And on that basis, zazen became very special to him, right? So he encountered something, he had a meeting with something before he stuck his head in and tried to study it. So anyway, according to the gate statement, if we really understand the nature of time, then we don't disregard any opportunity to hear and absorb and be in the middle of spoken teachings. So the Lotus Sutra in particular encouraged people to recite it. It frequently encouraged people to propagate it in some way. One of those ways was to recite it. It says that anyone who recites the sutra or expounds the contents of the sutra does that in the place of Buddha, or carries the Buddha on his or her shoulders, right? So to simply be the vessel of this thing was to take the place of Buddha, was to be a Buddha. Take on the characteristics of Buddha, or take on that role, right? So reciting the, or teaching this sutra, according to the sutra, is important because anybody who hears it is said to instantly attain awakening. So it's important for the person who's expounding it, but just to hear and encounter those teachings in a spoken way means immediately that person attains awakening. So the sutra says, when this person joyfully speaks the Dharma, those who hear it but for an instant shall instantly achieve ultimate anyatara sanyak sambodhi, ultimate awakening, right? So if we're not listening when that opportunity comes along, because maybe we think we've got some other chance, well, maybe not, right? We need to seize that opportunity while we can, according to this. So when I say stuff like that, then people sometimes say, well, does that mean we need to be hypersensitive, all the time, looking for those teachings and trying to, drive ourselves crazy by making sure we don't miss something, right? Well, no, of course, impossible, right? And that would be fixating on some idea about what practice is, what teachings are, what we are as practitioners. I think if we're approaching things in that way, we develop some real clinging, right? We start to really write stories about ourselves. We can create problems in relationships around that. Like, I really have to sit this session, no matter what it does to my family or my coworkers or something, right? We really can become quite grasping, spiritually materialistic, if you will, about that. That's not what this is saying. I don't think it's possible to sort of keep all the senses open all the time and be grasping, grabbing, stuffing Dharma in our pockets, because we don't want to miss anything. Not possible, right? So I think instead we let all of these teachings sort of seep in gradually, which is what happens in our practice anyway, right? We sort of immerse ourselves in the Sangha, in the teachings, in our sitting practice. Gradually over time, somehow this stuff gets into the body, it sort of seeps into your clothes. Some shift happens in your perspective. So if we sit shikantaza, we have an established shikantaza practice. We deeply experience time, for instance, in the way that Dogen sees time, or the way that he considers time. Then we start to understand some things about this gate statement, and not in a way which is grasping and clinging and I have to sort of figure it out, right? Simply immersing ourselves in the shikantaza practice, dropping the barriers, opening the hand. We maybe start to experience time in a little bit of a different way. And also what spoken teaching is about. So we can see that in the conventional view of time, again, our lifespan is limited. We're subject to illness and old age and death. We really kind of get a very intimate experience of that when we're sitting. We don't want to look back at the end of our lives and say, gee, I wish I'd taken the time to practice more. I wish I'd done more sitting, or I wish I'd, carried out my vows with some more wholeheartedness or something like that. Our circumstances are changing all the time. So we know it may or may not be possible to practice tomorrow or next year or later on in life. So we can also see that it's important to stay focused on our vows, not to be distracted by other things that come along, chasing after things. It doesn't mean that we renounce our karmic conditioning and necessarily leave our homes and families and go live in a cave. But in the midst of all of that, do we keep the vows in front of us, right? Do we continue to have that aspiration? Doing Rakvasatsu once a month is a great way to remind ourselves, oh yeah, there's these vows, no matter what it is I'm doing, what my role is in the world, what I'm trying to carry out, here's what I vowed to do. That's where my focus is, right? So whether you do it in this form or you do it as a householder, those vows are still there. So to move in that direction, to take steps in that direction, is to practice without wasting time. And we can see that because time is absolute, we can only act in this eternal now. So we can't act, we can't change what's already happened. We can make a plan to practice in the future, but that's not where we're practicing. Where we're practicing is here. So this is our opportunity. This is our chance to practice without wasting time. We got to do it now, right? So my awareness of time says that's enough for me. I'm interested to hear what all you might have to say. There's plenty to chew on here. Do you have things you'd like to say or ask or reflections you'd like to throw out? And don't forget to unmute before you do that, because we actually want to hear you. I love how everyone has to think it over. Sagan's got a hand up.
I think in connection with what you were saying about hearing, hearing a teaching, I recall Hojo-san on various occasions talking about, I guess you'd call it like the process of learning Dharma or hearing. I remember him saying there were like four steps involved. The first is to hear something about the Dharma. And the second is like to think about it or consider that what you heard. And then the next step is to start practicing that teaching. And then the fourth thing is the realization of that teaching. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it really seems to connect with what you were saying about something being orally received.
Yeah. Well, and of course, in the earliest days of the Buddhist Sangha, these things weren't written down, right? The original teachings were given orally and remembered, supposedly, for a long time until the council could get together and actually write these things down. So all of that teaching was transmitted orally. And I just think there's something kind of immediate about that, right? I mean, that is a real encounter between two people about Dharma. So yes, hearing the Dharma has been important from the beginning. And today we have other options. We can watch a recorded video of somebody, from anywhere in the world giving a talk. And, so it's a different encounter, but it's still an encounter, right? I think there's maybe a different quality to it. But yes, hearing has always been important. And as I say, even the sutras say, please go out and chant me. Please let somebody hear me, right? Because this is the way we take it in. Because of course, in those early days, not everybody could read. You had a certain kind of education and role to even be able to read and write those things. So to hear a story or to hear a teaching or to hear some chanting has always been important. For those of us that do some baika singing, and there's at least 3 of us in this room at the moment, or there were, one of the reasons that that's an important practice is somebody gets to hear the Dharma who maybe wouldn't hear it otherwise, right? So yes, hearing it's important.
I wonder if it also connects in some way to the notion of like mind-to-mind communication or mind-to-mind transmission, in the sense that, it takes a human being expressing something for the other human being to receive that.
Sure. Yeah, I think there's a relationship there. And also, I think, again, we can remember that according to Dogen, even insentient beings are preaching the Dharma. So it isn't even just human to human. Are we open enough, aware enough to take in all of those Dharma teachings, go through all of those gates. And again, it's not a process of, I'm going to, like take notes on everything I'm hearing, but, can we accept hearing those teachings from all of our teachers, right? Other things folks would like to say? Since speaking and hearing is our important topic today, in addition to the awareness of time. Say again, Hoshin.
I really like this. This is, it's so poignant. I liked what you said early on about time is the absolute present, eternal now. And I've been kind of pouring through some of the stuff that Katagiri talked about. One of the things about the present is remembering to be present. About our practice is remembering to be present. He says, Katagiri says, when you remember the place you already are, then you are free to burn, here we are with fire again, the flame of your life force in whatever you do. And I guess remembering to practice means you're remembering the place that you are and available to this moment. And in effect, it's shikantaza.
Mm-hmm.
So just to put that out there.
Yeah, well, I really like your phrase, you're available to this moment. Because if we are trying to live in the past or trying to live in the future, we're kind of not available to this moment, are we? Even though in the absolute way, we're not disconnected because it's not possible. In some way, we're just not open to this moment, right? We're not available.
Right, right.
Katagiri Roshi wrote a lot, or said a lot, which was transcribed later, about time, right? One of his books is mostly about time.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. And again, burning, yeah, so yeah, we still have this burning, right? Although in this case, it's kind of a positive thing, right? You're burning your life. How did you say, burning your life force or something like that?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so it reminds me of when, what did Uchiyama Roshi say about that? Completely digesting your life, right? It's like there's no part of your life which is not somehow in dynamic relation to you, which is a weird way to say that because there is no separation, so there really isn't a relationship. But, in our more conventional way of thinking, it's like we're fully engaged, right? Which, yeah, I mean, that's being available at this moment. Yeah, that's a nice quote. Thank you.
It's, sure, it's really, it's Dogen Zenji's Shobo Genzo Zenkei.
Yeah, of course.
Total dynamic function. So.
Yes, yeah. It's always interesting when we read these transcribed talks by Japanese teachers who came here. We want to credit them with being so original, and 9 times out of 10, they're explaining the Shobo Genzo, right? It's like not new teaching, but it's in a way that's more accessible for us, so it's really helpful.
Right.
His books are really helpful. Returning to Silence was the first Zen book I ever read, but I was practicing in Minnesota too. So.
Right.
Yeah. Other things people would like to say? All right. Okay. Well, I think let's do our closing chant. I'm going to throw it back to Hoshin for any announcements that he wants to make, unless anybody has any final thoughts. Okay. Thanks so much.